The introduction of many of us to Unitarianism in Augusta was an ad in the local paper that the American Unitarian Association had been publishing in the 50s. Are you a Unitarian without knowing it? Do you believe the Bible to be an inspiring human document rather than the literal Word of God? Do you believe that man, this is 1954, is not condemned by the doctrine of original sin, but is inherently capable of improvement? Do you believe that the development of character to be more important than the accepting of religious creeds? Do you believe that the purpose of religion is to help us live this life nobly and constructively rather than to emphasize the preparation for an after existence? The Unitarian answers are affirmative. Joined with other religious liberals who insist upon individual freedom of belief and the use of reason in religion. One requirement for my being up here is to be old. Since I went somewhere at 24 and have continued going for the last 65 years, I qualify. It is interesting to be 89. I renew my magazines 1 year at a time and don't consider life memberships. I just expect to wake up in the morning. Andy mentioned some of my the view from 70 and 80. I never imagined I might be able to do the view from 90. In the spring of, I mentioned 1954, the ad, Are You a Unitarian Without Knowing It, appeared in the Augusta Herald. In 1954, Augusta had 2 newspapers. It announced a meeting with Monroe husbands. At the meeting, husbands explained the fellowship concept that had been organized in Aiken by Yankees down to build the Savannah River plant, and that one was planned for Augusta. At that time, almost all Unitarian churches were located in New England and large cities like Atlanta. So they created the Church of the Larger Fellowship, a church by mail. That's mail, not email. Members received sermons and other materials and religious education programs for children. They noticed groups of 8, 10, 12 individuals in smaller cities like Augusta. So someone came up with the idea of forming fellowships. A fellowship is a lay-led group of 10 or more members. The fellowships provide many of the services of churches. A Sunday meeting, religious education for children, support for individuals in need. It is what we were looking for. So 65 years ago, on July 18th, 1954, 12 people gathered in Don and Peggy Kelly's home, signed a guest book that became the membership book, and formed the Unitarian Fellowship of Augusta. Note that it was Unitarian alone and remained so until the Unitarian and Universalist churches merged in 1961 and created the Unitarian Universalist Association. Our fellowship was one of 10% that voted against the merger. Unitarian Universalist Association is a mouthful, so I'll be usually say UU and UUA. Betty and I obviously viewed it as important because on August 8th, our second wedding anniversary, we attended the first meeting at the Walton Way Temple. The fellowship flourished. All of us except Peggy Kelly were there because we had found that the theologies of the churches we grew up in did not pass our test of reason, and that were not consistent with the universe discovered by science and the test of reason. Peggy's grandfather had been the minister of the Unitarian Church in Atlanta, and she was our only born Unitarian. After meeting in a half-dozen rented quarters, including a ballet studio and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we reached 40 members and decided we wanted a building of our own. Kay and Jim Sutherland had met Judge Hammond, the village heretic, and visited him on his front porch, sipping mint juleps, I imagine. They convinced him that we were not like the other churches, and he sold us an acre adjacent to his camellia garden. I like to imagine that we're sitting in among his camellias. On it, we built the rectangle with the classrooms and the common room and half of the lobby. On a grown-up lot next to us, an older woman lived in a house without electricity and running water. Her daughter, in New York, controlled the property, and with the help of a Unitarian lawyer in New York, we managed to buy it. Carl Rogers ran a hose over to the house, and for the first time she had some water. But she soon moved, and we cleared the lot, which is now our parking lot. In 1969, we became the UU Church of Augusta and called our first minister the Reverend Don Goldthwait. Over the 65 years, we have had 7 settled ministers and 4 interim ministers, the latest being the Reverend Don Cameron, who is with us now. In 1975, the Aiken Fellowship ceased operation. They had purchased a small building that had been part of the horse set and donated it to us. We tried to maintain a presence in Aiken, but could not. So we sold the building and used the proceeds to expand the lobby and add the office wing. The plaque in the entrance to the office commemorates the Aiken Fellowship's gift. In 1985, we added this meeting room. If you have wondered about the hole in the back of the wall, the first plan had the congregation facing the entrance to punish the latecomers, I assume. And the hole was to allow projection of movies on the back wall. Our meetings were simple. Opening music, opening words, the collection. One thing we have always done is pass the basket, now the plate. This was followed by the sermon, closing words, and closing music. For most of the first 30 years, we used recorded music. A personal note, it is hard for me to believe, but I was the church musician, even though I have had very little musical talent. Every Saturday, I would select and record 3 pieces of music on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. On Sunday mornings, I would bring the recorder out here, set it up in the corner of the common room next to the kitchen, and play the music. In case you're wondering, my eyesight is not what it was. After the closing music, everyone would go out, get a cup of coffee, and return for the talkback discussion. It is one activity that sets us apart from most other churches. In most churches, you receive the Word of God from the pulpit. In this church, you listen to the views of an individual, and these views are open to discussion. This is, as you will have noticed, the anniversary from my perspective. Following this tradition, we will have a talk back this morning where you can put in your perspective. UUs take pride in having no creed. That allows the group to change with the times or drift with the current, depending on your perspective. Over the 66 years, changes have occurred. A move from liberal Christianity through humanism with reason as the defining principle on to the current emphasis on diversity of belief. I found that I could observe the changes by looking at the topic categories in the 3 hymnals in use over the 65 years. In 1937, the hymnal was that of a Christian church with the Trinity removed. It was still male-oriented and gender-neutral language had not yet arrived. So the one topic was Our Fathers. By 1967, with an increasing awareness of sexism, the topic became Mothers and Fathers. And if you look in your current hymnal, you would find a category, Men and Women, under which you will be told to see women and men. You can look. That's a few instances from our history. If you'd like more details, you can see some additional sources on the handout in your bulletin. Lynn Dennison has written an excellent history of the first 25 years. For a copy, send an email to Lynn, and maybe one of you will be inspired to cover the next 40. Also listed is the story of UUCA, the Unitarian Universalist Church of an obscure southern town, written for our 50th anniversary. A somewhat irreverent history that, for example, gives the real source of the name Unitarian. One Sunday morning, an obscure Transylvanian priest, Dan Unitarian, ran out of bread and wine and substituted donuts and coffee. And also an item change via 3 hymnals that shows how UU thought has changed. For a copy of either, send me an email. While there have been major changes in viewpoint in this church and the UUA, one thing has remained constant: a commitment to social justice. In addition to our dissatisfaction with the theology of our previous churches, we were concerned about how these beliefs influence their stand on major social issues. For example, the Apostle Paul told women to obey their husbands and remain silent in churches. And various aspects of this continue in many churches. Women played an important role in the founding of the fellowship, but even then, women tended to end up as secretaries. Our first male secretary didn't appear till 1976. But Kay Sutherland, later O'Hannison, was not the secretary type, and she became our 5th president. Our second record wasn't too good for the first 25 years, but if you look at the list of presidents in the hall, I think you'll see that we have had a good record since then. I'll admit that white male heterosexuals need to be careful when speaking for other groups, but I think we have a good record on sexism. It will be hard for most of you to imagine, but in 1954, Augusta was a segregated city. Separate schools, separate drinking fountains, separate sections on the buses. But Unitarians and Universalists had been leading advocates for abolition, and we always planned to be open to all. As many of you remember, a Unitarian minister, James Reeb, became an icon in the protests of the 60s. During the Selma March, he was beaten badly. The Black Hospital in Selma didn't have adequate facilities to treat him, and the white hospitals in Selma and Montgomery refused to admit him, so he had to travel to Birmingham, where he died 2 days later. Somewhere on our lot is or was a dogwood tree planted in his honor. When we held our meeting to vote on proceeding with our first building, we also held a vote to affirm that we were fully committed to an open membership. I now wonder if the concrete screen in front of the windows in the common room was to make it harder to throw a rock through them. Shortly after moving into the building, members of the church and others in the community established the Open Door Kindergarten, the first integrated school of any kind in Augusta. It met here for many years until it became too crowded, but it remains today at the Walton Way Temple as the Open Door Preschool. It has been often noted that individuals in the past were prisoners of their time. Thomas Jefferson is a prime example. We would not be here today without people like him. He selected passages from the New Testament and created what became known as the Jefferson Bible. His story begins with the birth of Jesus to Mary and Joseph and ends with his death and burial. And Jefferson wrote he was resigned to himself to being a Unitarian by himself. I bring up prisoner of his time to give a little love to Jefferson, who I still admire, even though he never fully escaped his prison. He knew that slavery was wrong, but could not give up, could not free his slaves. But my main reason for bringing this up is to point out that we can be prisoners of our time too. In 1954, a third major social justice subject, homosexuality, had not entered into our consciousness. The closets were still full. I found on the web a UU LGBT timeline that doesn't begin until 1967, when the UUA did a survey of its members on beliefs and attitude. It had a question on homosexuality that I have always found fascinating. Listen carefully. Here were your choices. Homosexuality should be discouraged by law. Homosexuality should be discouraged by education. Homosexuality should not be discouraged, or it should be encouraged. Well, what do you think the responses were a mere 52 years ago? by liberal religion. 8% of UUs believe that homosexuality should be discouraged by law. 80% should be discouraged by education. Only 12% that it should not be discouraged, and a tiny 1% that it should be encouraged. Maybe spurred on by this result, in 1970, the General Assembly passed a resolution to end discrimination against homosexuals and bisexuals that called on congregations to develop sex education programs that promote healthy attitudes towards all forms of sexuality. In 1964, a General Assembly business resolution affirmed the practice of UUA clergy performing services of union between same-gender couples. We still couldn't quite stretch to calling it marriage. And in 1987, our minister, Rod Thompson, performed a double lesbian union service that received near unanimous support, but led to editorials in the Chronicle by editor Phil Kent and letters to the editor by fundamentalist minister Timothy Fellows. If we had to have enemies, we couldn't have done better than Kent and Fellows. It shows that we can change and maybe makes us a little more tolerant of Jefferson 200 years ago. I think the UUA in this church can be proud of our 65 years of support and leadership in these areas. Well, that's the last 65 years. They are gone and cannot be changed. The next 65 are in your hands and will be created as time goes by. For the immediate future, the church membership has been slowly declining for the past 10 years. But for those of you who remain, it is an important community. And looking at other churches in the area suggests that many potential members are out there. Who are these potential members? I'll find it in a minute. Who are they, I asked? People like you. My suggestion, look for people like you and invite them to visit. New members start out as first-time visitors. What about the deeper future? If you follow what is called the religious landscape, you will see major changes. In much of the Western world, churches are empty. The U.S. has been the exception, but change is here, as one writer noted. It's only a matter of time before, even in the United States, would gradually lose its religiosity. Religions founded on Bronze Age and medieval understandings of the world are limited in how many belief upending scientific discoveries they can adjust to before they find the constant conflict exhausting. If you've been following what is happening, you will have noted that they're starting with the millennial generation, those now 22 to 37, the fastest growing religious group or non-religious group in the United States has been the nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S. The nuns include those claiming no religious affiliation along with atheists and agnostics. The nuns now make up 24% of the population, but 1/3 of the millennials, and an even higher number in the next generation, as more and more children will grow up in homes where the parents do not attend a church. I think the continuing decline of existing religions is inevitable and can have a positive impact on our ability to deal with many issues. But I do see a negative side. Organized groups have a major advantage. They are much more effective in a community than the same individuals alone, and can provide support and help to their members in need. The nuns are unorganized and live in isolation, losing the advantage of an organization. You may want to consider whether you want to continue to make diversity your defining principle. For sure, avoid emulating the declining religions and see if you can find something out there that appeals to the nuns, the millennials, and the younger generations who are the future. So I invite you to put your thoughts on your legacy card and put them in the box in the hall, and return here at 12:30 for the talk back and discussion.